a new paradigm perspective, it's necessary to treat both prevailing malaise as well as think of creative solutions for the future. So for example, something like unsustainable consumption is something that we need to curb while simultaneously creating a society that's more aware and more enlightened and perhaps consumes in an enlightened manner. In practical terms, we feel like this requires long-term and short-term solutions. For example, consuming environmentally friendly is one step, but in the new paradigm perspective, it might be that that's actually a short-term sort of a goal for us to become environmentally more aware consumers. But in the long run, it is actually to curb our consumption habits and really think about, well, do we really need this? So in this forum, that's what we are going to introduce, which I think is a topic that hasn't been explored in Bhutan at all. I don't know, I've never not been to a forum tackling sustainable consumption. Of course, I think in our history, we didn't really have to think of it because, as we pointed out in the morning, we talked about our traditional practices, and a lot of things are probably sustainable in our rural areas, with our grandparents, and maybe even during our parents' time. But in today's world, I think we are now faced with lots of choices and goods, and so sustainable consumption becomes something that we have to be aware of. So in this forum, there are some questions that we hope our speakers will address. Some of the questions we had were, what is sustainable consumption, first of all, and why is it important? Also, what is the relevance of sustainable consumption in Bhutan? And also, what can governments do? What can we as individuals do? What can businesses do? What can communities do to live in a more sustainable way or consume in a more sustainable way? And also, what the challenges are for achieving such a society. We'll have two speakers. I have Ms. Laura TURLEY and TILMANN LIEBERT from the International Institute for Sustainable Development.
Come to our Green Public Procurement in Bhutan project. The project is aimed at scaling up public demand for sustainable products in Bhutan, something that has not been undertaken strategically yet and comprehensively. And when we say products, we're speaking of course, goods that the government procures for its different ministries, agencies, but also of services that the government sources from the private sector, as well as infrastructure projects. And this is also an important focus in our broader procurement work. What we are aiming for, the objective of this project, it's a cross-cutting industrial approach linked to Bhutanese development priorities. So cross-cutting in the sense that procurement by definition, as government procures so many different things, it's cross-cutting in terms of what goods, what services, from food over vehicles to buildings, anything, any cross-cutting. And this is why it's such a powerful approach that it can affect so many areas under one theme, that is procurement. And of course linking this to the many, also in international comparison, exemplary approaches and activities. We talked about gross national happiness this morning, the work of the NDP. So we don't want to work, it's not planned for this project to be working in a vacuum, but to be connected to what is going on and learn and see where this project can really make a difference that's of interest to Bhutan.
I know some people weren't here this morning, but I think everyone has maybe been to at least one of the morning sessions where the NDP work was presented. So I'll just launch from the idea that this model is kind of familiar. And indeed, in my discussions with the NDP staff, we sort of started thinking exactly how can this new project that we're launching in Bhutan really support and sort of synergize with ongoing initiatives. And just like we were saying again this morning, I found this model very adaptable, very useful to kind of play with and to see how it can relate to our project. And I'm sure others would find the same if they sort of thought how this model can relate to their work. in the sustainable development domain. So kind of briefly, I think the idea of a paradigm, as we were saying this morning, is just that. It's the idea of a new framework, a new way of thinking, a new kind of, as Pem was saying this morning, wearing a new lens to see things. But certainly reading the document, it's clear that this is a guiding document, it's a vision, and then what it requires is kind of action plans or ways to realize, ways to implement some of these ideas, which are so great and inspirational, but certainly big ideas. And so I think we feel quite strongly that green public procurement does have some strong links to the NDP model and indeed gross national happiness more broadly. And we were also pleased to read in the report that there's sort of you're actively looking as well for research institutes to take up some of these ideas and drive them forward. And we're very pleased to potentially contribute to that, to that role. So at the same time, we recognize that government purchasing and government procurement is one piece of a larger puzzle. Certainly it's not the entire NDP framework, nor is it all of sustainable consumption and production, but government purchasing is actually quite significant. And when we did sort of some of our background research on Bhutan, I think some of the figures we're looking at is that it takes up as much as 60 to 70% of the government budget per year is on buying new infrastructure, new products and services for the population. And that's an important role, an important function that government fulfills, and they need to do that. But this is to show that it is a significant amount of money and a significant amount of resources that goes into public procurement. So on that note, the idea that if the government adopts some sustainable consumption and production practices, that has a pretty big potential to sort of spark more and more initiatives, and both on the supply side and the demand side. The more the government sends out a signal to say, we're increasingly looking at buying sustainably produced timber, or increasingly looking at buying paper for our offices with 80–100% recycled content, that this is really sending a signal, if you just think of sort of basic supply and demand, sending a signal to markets that there is a demand for some new products with social or environmental criteria. So we think it does have a big role in the SCP discussion.